The bond had always been a living thing, a humming thread of silver and shadow that sang between them, constant as a second pulse beneath her skin. For 100 years, it had been her cage and her comfort, the source of her deepest loneliness and the only proof she was not entirely alone. It was the price of a peace treaty signed in blood and magic before she was born, a tether binding the human kingdoms to the vampire throne through her. She was the sacrifice, the living seal on a fragile armistice. And he had never once tried to understand it. Tonight, the throne room was colder than the crypts below. The air, thick with the scent of frozen stone and beeswax, did not move. It was a mausoleum for a living king, and she, a ghost haunting its halls before her time. Cation sat on the obsidian throne, a figure carved from night and arrogance, one long-fingered hand resting on the polished arm, the other tracing the rim of a crystal goblet filled with something the color of a dying rose. The firelight from the great hearth caught the edges of his dark hair, the sharp planes of his face, the crimson depths of the wine, but no warmth dared to touch him. He was a creature of absolute stillness, absolute control. Except for the bond. Through it, she could feel the thrum of his impatience, a low, predatory boredom that chafed against the placid surface he presented to the world. It was an irritation he could not soothe, a window into his soul he could not shutter, and he hated her for it. "You wished to see me," he said. His voice was a low baritone, smooth as polished jet, but it carried across the vast, echoing space as if he'd whispered it directly into her ear. Through the bond, she felt the words form, the slight vibration in his chest, the cool dismissal behind them. Ilara stood before the dais, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white mountains on a pale landscape. She had worn a simple dress of deep blue wool, eschewing the silks and jewels he provided. She wanted to feel like herself tonight, what little of that was left. Her own voice was a tremor in the oppressive silence. She took a breath, drawing strength from the cold air, a poor substitute for courage. "I have a request." A flicker of amusement, sharp and metallic, pricked her through the bond. He did not move, but his eyes, the color of ancient blood, narrowed slightly. "A request," he repeated, savoring the word as if it were a novel delicacy. "The Queen of Nothing, who has everything, has a request." The casual cruelty of it was a physical blow. Queen of Nothing. That is what she was. A consort in name, a prisoner in reality. She had the run of the castle, the finest gowns, the most exquisite food she could never bring herself to eat. She had everything but a key. Everything but a choice. "I want you to release me," she said, the words tasting of rust and desperation. "Sever the bond. Let me go." For a moment, there was only the crackle of the fire. The thrum of his impatience through the tether stilled, replaced by a wave of something so cold it was like plunging her hand into a frozen river. It was surprise, stark and absolute. Then, it was gone, replaced by a dark, simmering anger that felt like the air before a lightning strike. He still did not move, but the pressure in the room, the weight of his ancient power, intensified until the air grew thick and hard to breathe. "Let you go," he said, his voice losing its silken edge, becoming something harder, sharper. "The bond is not a trinket to be discarded when you tire of it. It is the foundation of the accord. It is the only thing keeping your fragile, sputtering little kingdoms from being extinguished." "The accord is a century old," Ilara countered, her voice gaining a desperate strength. "Your reign is absolute. There are no more factions vying for your throne. There are no human lords foolish enough to raise arms against you. It is obsolete." "A relic, I am a relic," she thought, and felt the bitter truth of it echo in the hollow space inside her. "It is a symbol," he corrected, his voice dropping low, dangerous. "And symbols have power. They are a reminder. To your people, of the price of their continued existence. To my court, of the necessity of restraint through the bond." She felt the truth of it twist into a lie. It was a symbol of his power. His conquest. She was the final, most beautiful spoil of a war his father had won. "I cannot live like this any longer," she whispered, the fight draining out of her, leaving only the raw, aching truth. "I have no self left, Cation. I am a mirror for your moods, a vessel for your consciousness. When you are angry, I am filled with rage. When you are hungry, I feel the phantom ache in my teeth. I have not had a thought that was purely my own in decades. I am. Disappearing, her hands trembled, and she finally let them fall to her sides. She looked at him, truly looked at him, trying to breach the impossible distance between the dais and the floor, between his immortality and her fleeting life. I am asking you. As a person. Please. Set me free. He watched her, his expression unreadable, a mask of cold porcelain. The anger through the bond had subsided, replaced by something she couldn't name. It was vast and empty and old. For a wild, impossible second, she felt a flicker of something that felt like hope. Then, he threw his head back, and he laughed. It was not a sound of mirth. It was a crack of breaking ice, a cascade of shattering glass. It was a sound of pure, undiluted arrogance and disbelief. It filled the cavernous hall, bouncing off the stone walls, mocking the tapestries, sneering at the very notion of her request. It was the cruelest sound she had ever heard. And through the bond, she felt the engine of it, not amusement, but a profound, unbreachable contempt. Contempt for her weakness, for her humanity, for the sheer audacity of her plea. He did not believe she had the power to make such a threat. He did not believe she had any power at all. That sound, that laugh, was the end. It was the final grain of sand that sent the whole crumbling edifice of her hope crashing into dust. In that moment, the 100 years of quiet endurance, of patient waiting, of hoping he might one day see the woman chained to his soul, all of it curdled into a cold, hard certainty. He would never see her. He was incapable of it. The laughter subsided, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. He leaned forward, a predator enjoying the final terror of its prey, his eyes gleaming with dark humor. Sever the bond, he chuckled, the sound a low rumble in his chest that she felt in her own bones. My dear, you are the bond. To sever it would be to unmake yourself. You haven't the strength. You haven't the will. Elara looked at him, and for the first time, she felt nothing but a great, desolate calm. The desperation was gone. The fear was gone. The love she had once, foolishly, nurtured for the man behind the monster was a dead and brittle thing. He was right about one thing. It would unmake her. But some things were worse than being unmade. Being a ghost in her own life was one of them. She met his mocking gaze, held it, and did not offer another word. She simply closed her eyes and reached inside herself, to the place where the silver thread was woven into the very fabric of her soul, and began to pull. The severing was not an act of magic, but an act of UN creation. It was not a spell to be spoken, but a pain to be endured. Elara stood on the cold stone floor, eyes closed, a statue of quiet defiance as the king's mocking smile slowly faded from his lips. He was watching her, she knew, feeling the strange shift through the bond, the sudden, intense concentration of her will. He would think it was a tantrum, a final, pathetic display of mortal histrionics. He could not conceive of what she was about to do. Inside her, the bond was a root system of pure light, woven through every nerve, every vessel, every thought. It had been part of her for so long she could not remember a time before its constant, low hum. It was the melody of her life, a song she had never chosen. To remove it was not like cutting a rope. It was like tearing the veins from her own body, one by one. She found the first thread. It was anchored deep in her heart, a shimmering filament that pulsed with his ancient, steady rhythm, a beat that had long ago overwhelmed her own. For a century, she had mistaken its constancy for strength, its presence for companionship. Now she saw it for what it was, a parasite. With a breath that felt like it was tearing her lungs, she focused all of her being, all of her pain, all of the humiliation of his laughter, and she pulled. The pain was white-hot, a searing agony that made her gasp. It was not physical, not in a way a blade could replicate. It was the pain of soul-flesh tearing. Through the bond's rapidly fraying connection, she felt a jolt of his shock, a sharp, questioning spike of alarm. What is this? The thought was not his voice, but the pure, unfiltered shape of his confusion, crashing against her consciousness. She ignored it. The first thread was free, and it recoiled from her heart like a dying serpent of light, dissolving into motes of dust in the void of her concentration. The absence it left was a gaping, cold wound. Her own heart stuttered, faltered, then found its own rhythm for the first time. It was a frantic, terrified, rabbit-quick beat. It was hers. She moved to the next anchor point, in the base of her skull, where the bond coiled around her thoughts. This was where his consciousness bled into hers, where his ancient memories flickered at the edges of her dreams, where his boredom and his rage and his cold, cold sorrow became her own. This was the source of her slow erasure. This one was woven deeper, thicker, its tendrils wrapped around her perception of the world. Untangling it felt like trying to separate ink from water. She gathered the memories of every time he had dismissed her, every time he had looked through her, every time she had felt his contempt like a physical chill. She remembered the faces of her long-dead family at the bonding ceremony, their tears a silent testament to her sacrifice. She remembered the first time she'd felt his hunger, a gnawing emptiness so profound it had sent her to her knees, weeping. She wove all of it, the grief, the loneliness, the indignity, into a blade of pure intention. She sliced through the tendrils. A scream tore through her mind, silent but deafening. It was a scream of pure, psychic agony. Colors exploded behind her eyelids, memories not her own flashed and died, the fall of an empire under a black sun, the taste of blood from a silver chalice, the face of a woman with eyes like stars, long turned to dust. His memories, his life, violently expelled from her own. Through the weakening link, she felt his roar of fury and disbelief. Stop. The command was absolute, the force of a king's will that had bent nations. For the first time in 100 years, it had no effect. She was no longer his subject. She was her own sovereign territory, and she was burning it to the ground to be free. Her knees buckled. Sweat beaded on her brow, cold as death. The world outside her concentration had faded to a dull, distant roar. There was only this internal battlefield, this terrible, necessary act of self-mutilation. One final, great root remained. It was the core of the bond, the very first thread that had been spun, linking them soul to soul. It was located somewhere central, everywhere and nowhere at once. It was not just in her body, it was her body. It was not just in her soul, it was her soul. This was what he meant. To sever it would be to unmake yourself. She felt his panic now, pure and undiluted. It was not concern for her. It was the terror of an immortal being facing a loss he could not comprehend, a change he could not control. He was pulling back, trying to withdraw his energy from the bond, to shore up his end of the connection, but she was not letting go. She was holding it fast, ready to tear it from its foundation. She paused. The pain was a constant, screaming ocean. The emptiness where the other threads had been was a void that threatened to swallow her whole. For a single, terrifying moment, she faltered. The humming quiet of the bond was familiar. The solitude awaiting her was not. To cut this last thread was to step off a cliff into an unknown sky. Then, she heard it again, echoing in her memory. His laugh. Cold, and sharp, and utterly dismissive. It was all the strength she needed. With a final, silent cry that was the death of the woman she had been, Ilara clenched the fist of her will around that final, foundational thread, and she ripped it out. The world went white. Then it went black. There was a sound like a universe being torn in two, a cataclysm of psychic energy that blasted outward from her. The silver thread, the constant song, the second pulse, it did not fade. It snapped. It shattered into a billion pieces of silent, glittering dust. And then, for the first time in a century, there was nothing. Only silence. A perfect, terrifying, absolute silence in her mind, in her soul, in her heart. She was alone. She was free. The force of the severing threw her to her knees. A choked gasp escaped her lips. The air rushed back into her lungs, cold and sharp and alien. She opened her eyes. The throne room swam back into focus, the colors painfully bright, the edges of things sharp enough to cut. The fire in the hearth was a roaring inferno. The silence was a physical weight. She looked up at him. Caitian was on his feet, his hand pressed to his chest, his face a mask of stunned horror. The goblet lay shattered on the floor, a splash of crimson pooling on the black stone like a fresh wound. His eyes, those ancient, all-powerful eyes, were wide with a terror she had never seen in him, a terror that made him look, for the first time, young. lost. He stared at her, not through her. He was seeing her, truly seeing her, a separate being, and the sight was breaking him. Ilara pushed herself to her feet. Her legs were trembling, frail as a newborn foal's. Every part of her ached with a profound, soul-deep exhaustion. The empty space inside her was a chasm. But she was standing. She was whole, in a broken sort of way. Her heart beat its own frantic, liberated rhythm. Her thoughts were quiet, pristine, entirely her own. She held his horrified gaze for one long, final moment. There was nothing left to say. The laughter had said it all. Her silence now was the answer. Without another word, she turned her back on the obsidian throne, on the king, on the 100 years of her life that had just ended, and she walked away. Each step was an agony and an ecstasy. Each step took her further into the terrifying, beautiful silence of her own self. The sound of Caitian's shattered gasp was lost in the vast, echoing emptiness she left behind. The silence was not peace. It was a vacuum. For a century, the bond had been a constant presence at the edge of his senses, a low thrum of another life intertwined with his own. He had felt her quiet sorrows, her flickering hopes, her suffocating boredom. He had felt them as one might feel the weather, an atmospheric condition to be noted and ignored. He had never considered that the atmosphere might one day vanish, leaving him in a total void. The laughter died in his throat, choked off by the psychic cataclysm. One moment he was seated on his throne, a king indulging in the casual cruelty that was his right, and the next, he was on his feet, thrown there by a force he could not see. It was as if a vital organ had been ripped from his body without anesthetic. A visceral, tearing agony centered in his chest, followed by an absolute, profound nothing. The hum was gone. The second pulse was gone. The faint, ever-present scent of her soul, like crushed lavender and winter frost, had vanished from his internal landscape. He reached for it, a reflexive, panicked gesture of the mind, and his consciousness slammed into a wall. Where there had been a bridge, there was now a chasm. Where there had been a connection, there was only his own, solitary, echoing self. He stared at her, and the woman he saw was a stranger. Before, his gaze had always been filtered through the bond. He saw her and felt her simultaneously, a composite being. Now, he saw only the surface. The pale, sweat-sheened skin. The dark blue wool of her dress. The tremor in her hands. And her eyes. Gods, her eyes. They had always been a deep, thoughtful brown, but they had been muted, clouded by the reflection of his own soul. Now they were clear. They were fiercely, terrifyingly her own, and they held an exhaustion so deep it looked like a form of death. And in them, he saw himself reflected, a monster, frozen in a rictus of shock and disbelief. She turned and walked away. The act was so simple, so quiet, and yet it was the most violent thing he had ever witnessed. It was a rejection more absolute than any army, more final than any death. She did not run. She did not look back. She simply walked, each step measured and deliberate, carrying her newly won, broken freedom away from him. He could not move. His limbs, which could shatter stone and move faster than a human eye could follow, were locked in place. A paralysis born of pure shock. His mind, which could hold 1,000 years of strategy and memory, was a maelstrom of a single, repeating thought: gone. It's gone. She's gone. The great doors of the throne room opened and closed, swallowing her from his sight. The sound of their closing was a thunderclap in the crushing silence of the hall. The silence of his mind. A low, guttural sound tore from his throat. It was not a word. It was the sound of a creature in mortal pain. He staggered back, one hand still pressed to his chest where the wound throbbed with emptiness. He stumbled against the dais and slid to the floor, the shards of the crystal goblet crunching beneath his boot. The spilled wine looked like his own lifeblood seeping into the stone. Alone. He was alone. He had been alone for centuries, of course. A king is always alone. An immortal is always alone. He moved through a world of fleeting creatures and lesser beings, his court a collection of predators bound by fear and ambition, not loyalty. He had cultivated his solitude, worn it like a mantle of power. It was his fortress. But this was different. This was not the solitude of a mountain peak, grand and chosen. This was the solitude of a sensory deprivation chamber. It was a maddening, suffocating absence. He hadn't realized how much he had relied on the bond, not as a tool of state, but as a simple, grounding presence. He had used her emotions as a barometer for his court, her quiet observations as a second set of eyes. He had felt the truth of a courtier's words through her guileless perception, sensed a threat in the flicker of fear she felt in a guard's presence. He had taken it, all of it, without acknowledgement, without thanks, like a man breathing air. And now he was suffocating. Panic, cold and sharp, a sensation he hadn't experienced since his first, bloody years of transformation, clawed at him. He was blind. He was deaf. A part of him had been amputated, and he was only now realizing he had never learned to live without it. His laughter echoed in his memory. The sheer, unadulterated arrogance of it. You haven't the strength. The memory was a hot brand against his pride. She had possessed a strength he couldn't even conceive of, the strength to mutilate her own soul to escape him. The thought was so staggering, so utterly humbling, that it brought him to his knees more surely than any blade. He had thought of the bond as his chain on her. He had never, in 1,000 years, considered that it was also her chain on him. That in her quiet, constant presence, there was a connection that kept the worst of his ancient coldness at bay. That she, the fragile human, had been anchoring him. Now, the anchor was gone. He was adrift in the vast, cold, silent ocean of his own immortality. And for the first time, he was terrified of the dark. The king who ruled the night was afraid of the emptiness he had created. He lowered his head into his hands, and the tremors that shook his powerful frame had nothing to do with rage, and everything to do with a loss so profound it felt like the beginning of his own unmaking. The silence in his head was the loudest sound he had ever heard. The castle was a house of ghosts. Ilara walked its familiar corridors, but nothing was familiar at all. Before, every stone, every tapestry, every sliver of moonlight slanting through a high window had been layered with a second set of perceptions, his. This hallway was where he had once felt a flash of irritation at a clumsy servant. That tapestry depicted a battle he remembered with cold satisfaction. The moonlight was something he found stark and clean, a welcome respite from the garish sun. Her world had been a palimpsest, her own experience written over faintly by his much older, bolder script. Now, the hallway was just a hallway. Cold stone, silent air. The tapestry was just woven thread, its figures frozen and meaningless. The moonlight was just moonlight, soft and sorrowful. The world had been returned to her, but it felt diminished, leached of a dimension she hadn't known she was seeing. It was like going from a world of color to one of gray, even as she knew the gray was hers. The freedom was a physical sensation, a terrifying lightness. She felt untethered, a kite whose string had been snapped in a gale. She half expected to float up to the vaulted ceilings, a lost soul in a vast, empty space. The phantom ache of the bond was a constant, throbbing presence, a hollowness in the center of her being. Her body remembered the connection, and its absence was a form of pain. She reached her chambers. They were opulent, a gilded cage he had furnished with thoughtless precision. Silks and velvets in shades of sapphire and silver, a bed large enough for four, a balcony that overlooked the sterile, manicured perfection of the royal gardens. For 100 years, this had been her prison. She had spent countless nights lying awake in that bed, feeling the echo of his hunts in the forests beyond, the cold thrill of the chase, the metallic taste of life taken. She had stared at her own reflection in the silver-backed mirror and seen a stranger with his weariness in her eyes. Now, the room was just a room. The silence was absolute. She went to the mirror and looked. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and dark in the candlelight. There were new lines of pain etched around her mouth. She looked broken. But the eyes were clear. There was no one else looking out from behind them. There was only Ilara. Frightened, exhausted, shattered Ilara. A profound, shuddering sob escaped her, a sound of both grief and relief. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass, her breath fogging the surface, obscuring the stranger who was herself. She had to leave. The realization was immediate and absolute. This castle was his territory, every stone saturated with his power, his presence. To heal, She needed neutral ground. She needed a place that held no memory of him, no echo of the bond. She needed a place that could be hers and hers alone. Moving with a newfound, if fragile, purpose, she ignored the vast wardrobes filled with gowns she had never wanted. She found a simple leather satchel, old and worn, that had belonged to her lady's maid years ago. Into it, she packed the essentials of a person she no longer knew how to be. A plain woolen dress. A thick cloak. A small, near-empty purse of human currency she had kept hidden away, a foolish, secret hope. At the last moment, her hand hovered over a small, leather-bound book on her nightstand. It was a collection of folk tales from her homeland, a gift from her mother on her 10th birthday, a lifetime ago. It was the one object in this entire opulent suite that was truly hers. Her fingers trembled as she placed it in the bag. It felt heavier than all the gold in the kingdom. She walked to the balcony, the cold night air a balm on her feverish skin. The gardens below were a geometric puzzle of shadow and moonlight. Beyond them, the dark teeth of the forest, and beyond that, a world she barely remembered. A world of mortals. A world where she might, perhaps, become a person again. There was no one to stop her. The guards in the halls were his creatures, loyal to his power, but they were accustomed to her silent, ghost-like movements. She was part of the castle's fixtures. It would not occur to them to question her leaving, because it had never occurred to them that she could leave. To them, she was not a prisoner who could escape, she was a feature of the king's power, as permanent as the throne itself. She slipped through the servants' corridors, a shadow among shadows. The smells of the kitchen, baking bread, roasting herbs, the scent of life, were so powerfully, achingly normal they brought tears to her eyes. She had been starved for normal. At a small, unassuming postern gate used by gardeners and scullery maids, she paused, her hand on the iron latch. This was it. The final step. Beyond this door was not just the world outside the castle, but the world outside him. It was a world where she would be cold, and hungry, and afraid. A world where no one knew her name. It was a world where she would be free. The hollowness inside her pulsed with a pain that was also a promise. She took one last, shuddering breath of the cold, sterile castle air, and then she opened the door and stepped out into the night. The damp, earthy smell of fallen leaves and wet soil filled her senses. It was the smell of decay and life, of endings and beginnings. It was the smell of the real world. She pulled her cloak tight around her, a frail shield against the vast, unknown dark, and did not look back. The first week was a lesson in noise. Not the noise of the court, the silken rustle of intrigue, the clink of goblets, the forced laughter, but the noise of his own mind. For 1,000 years, his thoughts had been a clean, cold, orderly kingdom. Now, it was a city under siege. The silence Alara had left behind was not empty, it was filled with the casement of his own unchecked consciousness. Without the soft, absorbent buffer of her presence, every stray thought, every flicker of irritation, every ancient memory became a deafening clamor. He sat in his council chambers, his ministers droning on about trade disputes with the southern provinces and the worrying boldness of war-creatures in the Blackwood. He tried to focus, to parse their words for the usual subtext of ambition and fear. But he had no barometer. Before, he would have felt a courtier's lie as a spike of anxiety from Alara, who, though she knew nothing of politics, was an unerring judge of human sincerity. He would have felt the chamber's collective tension rise or fall through her, a living gauge of his own authority. Now, he heard only the words. He saw only the carefully blank faces. He was flying blind. "My lord." Valerus, his seneschal, spoke, his voice a low gravelly rumble that cut through the fog of Kashan's distraction. "Lord Volkov awaits your judgment on the matter of the silver tithe." Kashan looked at the assembled vampires. Their faces were masks of polite expectation, but their eyes, ancient and predatory, glinted with something new. Curiosity. Speculation. They could feel the shift in him. His power had always been absolute, his focus unwavering. Now, he was distracted, his aura of command frayed at the edges. A king who was distracted was a king who could be challenged. "The tithe will be doubled," Kashan snapped, the words sharper than he intended. A murmur went through the room. It was a rash, punitive decision, not his usual calculated style. Lord Volkov, a sleek, ambitious vampire from an old and powerful line, bowed his head, but not before Cation caught the flicker of triumph in his eyes. He had provoked the king into an error. The absence of Alara's corresponding flicker of fear was a physical jolt. He had made a mistake, a political misstep that would have consequences, and he'd done it because the noise in his own head was too loud to permit careful thought. The realization was galling. He, Cation, who had played empires like chess pieces, was being outmaneuvered because he missed the emotional echo of a human girl. He dismissed the council with a curt wave of his hand. They filed out, their silence more damning than any comment. Only Valerus remained. The old vampire stood by the window, his back to Cation, looking out at the permanent twilight of the vampire lands. Valerus had served Cation's father. He was one of the few beings in existence who did not fear him. "She is gone," Valerus said. It was not a question. "The human grew tiresome," Cation replied, his voice a wall of ice. He walked to the sideboard and poured himself a goblet of blood, his movements stiff and precise. Valerus turned. His face was a roadmap of the ages, his eyes holding a wisdom that was weary, not cruel. "You are a fool, my king," he said, his tone one of quiet disappointment. "You held the sun in your hands and complained that it was warm." Cation's hand tightened on the goblet, the crystal groaning in protest. "She was a treaty," he snarled. "A political necessity. Nothing more." "She was for a decade, perhaps," Valerus countered, his gaze unwavering. "For the 90 years that followed, she was a companion to your soul, whether you wished to admit it or not. You have grown accustomed to a world with two sets of eyes, two hearts. Now you have only your own, and you are finding them insufficient." The truth of it was a shard of glass in his gut. He had never spoken of the bond's true nature to anyone, but Valerus, it seemed, had always known. "I am king," Cation said, the words a hollow echo of his former authority. "I am sufficient." "Are you?" Valerus walked towards him, his steps slow and deliberate. "You feel the silence, don't you? The great, screaming void where her quietness used to be. You thought her presence was the intrusion, the noise. You are only now discovering that the noise was you. She was the silence that made it bearable." Cation hurled the goblet against the far wall. It shattered, spraying a dark red constellation across a priceless tapestry. The act of violence brought him no release, only a fresh wave of impotent fury. "Enough," he roared, the sound shaking the very stones of the room. Valerus did not flinch. He simply looked at the stain on the wall, then back at his king. "You laughed at her," he said softly, and the quiet words were more damning than any shout. "I heard it, even from the library. The sound of a man breaking the only pure thing he has ever possessed. And for what? For pride. You have an eternity to rule, Cation. I wonder how long you will enjoy it alone." The old vampire bowed, a gesture of protocol that felt like a final judgment, and left the king to the ruin of his council chamber. Cation stood amidst the wreckage, the scent of spilled blood thick in the air. He looked at his own hands, at the power that could crush kingdoms, and felt a helplessness he had never known. Valerus was right. He had been using her as a shield against himself. Against the crushing weight of his own immortality. The bond hadn't been a chain on her, it had been his lifeline. And he, in his blind, stupid arrogance, had forced her to cut it. The silence in his mind pressed in, vast and unending, and for the first time, Cation understood the true meaning of the word forever. It was not a measure of time. It was the name of his new prison. The village of Oakhaven was nestled in a gentle curve of the Silverwood, a place that felt as if it had been misplaced by time. The buildings were a tumble of plaster and dark wood, their roofs thick with moss. The air smelled of wood smoke, damp earth, and the sweet, yeasty promise of the baker's morning work. For Alara, who had spent a century breathing the sterile, cold air of the undying court, it was an intoxicating perfume. It was the scent of life, messy and mundane and beautiful. She found work with Anya, the town's apothecary and librarian, a woman whose face was a fine net of wrinkles and whose eyes held the quiet knowing of the very old. Anya had asked no questions when Alara, cloaked and exhausted, had appeared at her door with a small purse of coins and a request for work, any work. She had simply nodded, shown Alara to a small, clean room above the shop, and put her to the task of sorting dried herbs. The work was a balm. The physical, repetitive tasks grounded her in the present moment. The slide of smooth vellum under her fingertips as she mended the spines of books. The sharp, clean scent of crushed yarrow. The weight of a wooden pestle in her hand. These were real things, tangible things. They were a world away from the phantom sensations and borrowed emotions that had defined her existence. She was relearning herself from the outside in. She learned that she liked the taste of honey in her tea, that the sound of rain on the roof soothed her, that she preferred the company of books to the chatter of the marketplace. These small, simple discoveries felt like reclaiming lost territory. Each preference, no matter how trivial, was a brick in the foundation of a new self. But the phantom limb of the bond still ached. At night, in the quiet of her small room, the silence would press in. It was a hollow space in her chest, a constant, low-grade throb of absence. She would wake from dreams where the silver thread was still intact, dreams where she could feel the cold, familiar weight of Caitian's consciousness beside her own. In those first moments of waking, the relief of her freedom was always mingled with a sharp, traitorous pang of loss. It was the Stockholm syndrome of the soul, and she hated herself for it. One evening, weeks after her arrival, she was shelving a new acquisition in the library section of the shop. The last of the evening sun slanted through the dusty window, illuminating the dancing motes of paper and herbs. Anya was sitting at her main desk, polishing a pair of spectacles. "You are quieter than the books, child," Anya said, her voice raspy like dry leaves. Alara startled, nearly dropping a heavy tome on botany. "I'm sorry. I did not mean to disturb you." Anya smiled, a gentle crinkling around her eyes. "It is not a complaint. It is an observation. Your silence is heavy, like a bell that has been rung so hard it has cracked." Alara froze, her hand resting on the spine of the book. No one had ever described her with such unnerving accuracy. In the undying court, she was a ghost, invisible. Here, in this dusty little shop, this old woman saw her. Truly saw her. "I have been through a difficult time," Alara said, the understatement a mountain. "We all carry our own ghosts," Anya said, placing her spectacles on her nose and peering at Alara over the top of them. "The trick is to learn whether they are haunting you, or if you are the one refusing to let them go." The words struck a chord deep inside Alara, in the hollow place where the bond used to be. Was she clinging to the memory of it? Was the ache she felt not just loss, but a refusal to fully inhabit this new, frightening silence? "How do you let them go?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "You don't," Anya replied, turning back to her polishing. "You cannot banish a ghost. You can only fill the house with so much life that it no longer has room to wander." Fill the house with life. The phrase echoed in Alara's mind. She looked around the shop, at the shelves overflowing with stories, with remedies, with the accumulated knowledge of generations. She thought of the simple, tangible tasks that had been her salvation. Perhaps that was the answer. Not to fight the emptiness, but to fill it. To build a life so solid, so real, so completely her own, that the phantom ache would be crowded out. That night, for the first time, when she lay in her small bed and felt the familiar hollowness, she did not recoil from it. Instead, she focused on the sensations of the present. The rough texture of the wool blanket against her skin. The scent of dried lavender from the sachet under her pillow. The sound of her own heart, beating steadily in the quiet dark. It was a small heart, a human heart, a heart that had been overshadowed for 100 years. But it was hers. And slowly, patiently, she began the work of filling her own house with her own life, one quiet heartbeat at a time. The silence was still there, but for the first time, it felt less like an absence and more like an empty room, waiting to be furnished. 2 months. It had been 2 months since the severing. 2 months of the screaming silence. 2 months of political fumbles and frayed tempers. 2 months of waking in his cold, empty sarcophagus and feeling the void beside him where her sleeping consciousness should have been. Caitian stood on the highest parapet of his fortress, the wind whipping his dark cloak around him. The eternal twilight of his lands stretched out below, a kingdom of shadows and stone that had once felt like the entirety of the world. Now, it felt like a cage. A magnificent, sprawling, powerful cage, but a cage nonetheless. He had everything a king could desire, and he was rotting from the inside out. Valerus had been right. He was insufficient. His power, his immortality, his ancient mind, none of it could fill the chasm she had left. He had tried to rule as he always had, through fear and calculation, but his calculations were off. His threats lacked their former weight. His court could sense the rot, the instability at the core of his power. Lord Volkov grew bolder with every passing day, his ambition a poison seeping into the foundations of the court. Cation knew he should crush him, make an example of him as he would have done without a second thought 3 months ago. But the will to do so, the cold, clean fire of his authority, was banked. It was smothered by the ash of his regret. He had sent his hunters out, of course. The best trackers in his service, creatures who could follow the scent of a single drop of blood across a continent. They had returned with nothing. They could find no trace of her. It was as if she had stepped out of the castle and simply dissolved into the air. He knew why. They were tracking a body, a physical presence. But she had been so intertwined with him for so long that her own physical essence was faint, her scent masked by his. When she severed the bond, she had, in a way, become invisible to his world. It was a final, brilliant irony. In escaping him, she had used the very nature of her imprisonment as a shield. The decision formed not as a thought, but as a primal, undeniable need. He could not rule like this. He could not live like this. The silence was a cancer, and it was killing the king he had been. He had to find her. Not to drag her back. The thought itself was now abhorrent. He could no more force the bond to be remade than he could command the sun to rise in his lands. It was a thing of soul work, and his soul was a barren, ravaged thing. No, he had to find her for another reason, a reason his pride still struggled to name. To apologize. The word was alien on his tongue, a concept for lesser beings. Kings did not apologize. But what was he, now? A hollow shell. A monarch of a silent kingdom in his own mind. He needed to understand. He needed to stand before her, without the filter of the bond, and understand the strength it took for a creature so fragile to perform an act of such cosmic violence upon herself. He needed to see the person he had failed to see for a century. Perhaps, in understanding her, he could begin to understand the new, broken creature he had become. That night, he summoned Valerus to the throne room. The old vampire entered to find Cation not on the throne, but standing before the great hearth, staring into the flames. He was dressed not in his royal finery, but in the simple, durable black leathers of a traveler. "I am leaving," Cation said, without turning. Valerus showed no surprise. "And the kingdom?" "It is yours to manage," Cation replied. "Lord Volkov will test you. Do not be as merciful as I have been." It was a command, but also an admission of his own recent weakness. "Where will you go?" Valerus asked, his voice carefully neutral. Cation finally turned. The firelight cast flickering shadows across his face, making him look both ancient and strangely vulnerable. "I am going to find her." "And what will you do if you find her, my king?" Cation was silent for a long moment, the honest answer a difficult, jagged thing to voice. "I will look at her," he said finally, his voice low and raw. "And I will listen." For the first time. He did not know where he was going. He had no magical trace to follow. All he had was a memory. The memory of her soul's scent, lavender and winter frost. It was nothing, a poet's fancy. But it was all he had. He would walk out of his fortress, out of his twilight lands, and into the bright, alien world of humanity. He would hunt not for blood, but for the echo of a silence. He would follow the ghost of a presence he had destroyed. It was a fool's errand. A mad quest. But it was the first thing in 2 months that felt like a purpose. It was the beginning of a penance. He, the king who had never walked among them, would now wander the world of mortals, a pilgrim searching for the soul he had thrown away. He was not hunting her to capture her. He was hunting her to learn the shape of his own sin. The quiet rhythm of Alara's new life was a fragile tapestry, and she feared the slightest pull on its threads. The seasons turned. Autumn bled its colors into the silverwood, and winter followed, blanketing Oakhaven in a soft, muffling layer of white. The silence in her soul remained, but it was no longer a screaming void. It was becoming a quiet space for contemplation, a room of her own. She learned the names of the villagers, the stories behind their scars, the small joys that illuminated their difficult lives. She was a part of something, in a small, unassuming way that she had never been in the grand, cold court. But sometimes, a chill would trace its way down her spine that had nothing to do with the winter air. A sudden sense of being watched. A flicker of movement at the edge of her vision that vanished when she turned. At first, she dismissed it as the lingering trauma of the bond, a phantom echo of his obsessive nature. Her nerves, she told herself, were still healing. Then, the whispers started. Travelers passing through Oakhaven spoke of a dark stranger, a tall man dressed in black who moved with an unnatural grace and asked strange questions. He did not ask for a woman by name, but described her with an unnerving, poetic precision. A woman with quiet hands and eyes the color of old earth. He paid for information with ancient coins that were themselves a curiosity, and he never stayed in one place for long, always moving, always searching. Fear, cold and familiar, coiled in Alara's stomach. It was him. She knew it with a certainty that defied logic. He was hunting her. The fear was different this time, though. It was not the passive, helpless fear of a captive. It was the sharp, active fear of a creature with something to lose. She had built a life here, a small, precious thing. The thought of his shadow falling across it, of his ancient power disrupting this fragile peace, was unbearable. Her first instinct was to run. To pack her small bag once more and disappear into the wider world. But the thought of it exhausted her. Oakhaven, with its gentle routines and quiet acceptance, had become a home. Anya's knowing smiles, the baker's morning greeting, the trust of the children who came to the library for stories, these were the threads of her new tapestry. To flee would be to unravel it herself. It would be to admit that he still had power over her, that his mere proximity could unmake her world. "The ghost is getting closer, isn't it?" Anya asked one afternoon, as Alara stood staring out the shop window at the snow-covered lane, her hands twisting in her apron. Alara jumped, her heart hammering. "I don't know what you mean." Anya sighed, a soft, weary sound. She came to stand beside Alara, her small, wrinkled hand resting gently on Alara's arm. The touch was warm, real. "Child, I am old. I have seen many things. I know the look of a person who is being hunted by their own past. You cannot outrun your own shadow. Sometimes, the only way to make it disappear is to turn and face the sun. Turn and face him." The thought was terrifying. What would he do? Would he try to force her back? Would his very presence be a poison, undoing all the healing she had so painstakingly accomplished? She remembered the arrogance in his laugh, the contempt. Had that changed? Or was this hunt just another expression of his possessiveness, a king retrieving a lost possession? "I can't," she whispered, the words trembling. "You don't know him. He is powerful. And you are not." Anya's gaze was sharp. "The woman who walked into my shop 6 months ago was a wraith, hollowed out by a pain I could not name. The woman standing before me now has learned to smile again. She has planted a garden in her own soul. That is a power great kings do not understand. Do not mistake his strength for your weakness." Anya's words were a small, warm coal in the cold pit of Alara's fear. She had survived the severing. She had built a life from the ashes of her old one. She was not the same woman who had stood trembling in his throne room. She had a self now, fragile as it was. And a self could be defended. The decision settled in her not with a crash, but with a quiet, solemn click, like a lock falling into place. She would not run. This was her home. This was her life. If he came here, he would be the intruder, the ghost. She would face him on her own ground, in the light of her own world. The fear did not vanish. It remained, a cold knot in her belly. But beneath it, something else was taking root. A grim, hard-won resolve. She had unmade herself to be free of him. She would not allow the memory of him to unmake her again. She would stand her ground. She would wait. And she would see what kind of man had followed her out of the darkness and into the world of the living. The prospect was terrifying, but for the first time, it was also laced with a sliver of defiant curiosity. She had changed. The great, unanswerable question was, had he? The world of mortals was an assault. Caitian, who had lived for a millennium in the muted, unchanging twilight of his own domain, found the human world to be a cacophony of sensation. The sun was a physical blow, a brazen, searing light that forced him to move only in the hours of dusk and deep night. The smells were overwhelming, a chaotic stew of sweat, cooking food, animal dung, and blooming flowers, all tangled together with an intensity that made his heightened senses ache. The people were a tide of fleeting, bright-burning lives, their emotions a constant, flickering static he could no longer interpret but could feel as a pressure against his skin. He moved through this world like a phantom, a creature out of time. He learned to cover his unnatural stillness, to mimic the small, useless movements of humans. He learned to speak to them, to ask his strange, oblique questions in a way that aroused suspicion but not outright panic. He was a king reduced to a vagrant, a god pretending to be a man. The humiliation was a constant, grinding stone against his pride, but it was a necessary penance. He was not tracking her scent, but the lack of it. He would enter a town and feel for the echo of her soul, the memory of lavender and frost. He would find only the loud, chaotic noise of other lives. And he would move on. His journey took him south, away from the cold, harsh lands of the north and into softer, greener country. He was following an instinct he didn't understand, a pull toward a place he had never been. It was in a grimy port city, amidst the smell of salt and tar and rotting fish, that he found the first real clue. He was speaking to an old sailor in a tavern, a man whose eyes had seen too much. Caitian described her, his usual litany of poetic observations. Quiet hands, eyes like old earth, the sailor mused, sipping at a mug of foul-smelling ale. Sounds like the lass who bought passage on the Sea Serpent a few months back. Bound for the southern coast. Said she was looking for a quiet place. Paid in gold so old the harbormaster thought it was fake. A jolt went through Caitian, the first flicker of success in a long and fruitless journey. Where was this ship headed, he asked, his voice tight with an emotion he refused to name as hope. Oakhaven, the sailor grunted. A little speck of a town up the Silverwood River. Nothing there but trees and old folks. A quiet place, indeed. Oakhaven. The name was nothing to him, a meaningless sound. But it was a destination. A direction. For the first time, his hunt had a focal point. He left the sailor a coin that made the old man's eyes go wide and melted back into the night. The journey up the Silverwood was a journey into a different world. The frantic energy of the cities gave way to a deep, pastoral quiet. The forest was ancient, the trees immense, their branches weaving a canopy that filtered the hateful sun into a dappled, gentle light. It felt peaceful. The word was unfamiliar. His own lands were silent, but it was the silence of a tomb. This was the silence of a sleeping thing, full of latent life. He found himself walking instead of using his inhuman speed, observing the play of light on the moss, the chattering of a squirrel in the high branches. He was seeing a world he had only ever flown over, a world he had considered nothing more than a feeding ground. He felt the change before he saw the village. The chaotic static of humanity lessened, thinning out into a collection of distinct, calmer presences. And beneath it, something else. A faint, impossibly faint echo. It was not the bond. It was not a connection. It was like smelling the perfume of a person who had left a room hours ago. Lavender and winter frost. His dead heart hammered against his ribs. She was here. He stopped at the edge of the woods as dusk began to bleed across the sky, cloaking the world in shades of purple and grey that were familiar and comforting. The village of Oakhaven lay before him, a cluster of warm, glowing lights against the encroaching dark. A thread of wood smoke curled from a chimney. He could hear the distant sound of a dog barking, the faint notes of a song from the tavern. It was a picture of such simple, fragile peace that it felt like a judgment against his entire existence. And she was in there. Somewhere in that little haven of light, she was living, breathing, being. Without him. The urge to stride into the village, to find her, to stand before her and demand. What? An audience. Forgiveness. It was a powerful, primal instinct. It was the king's instinct to take what he wanted. He crushed it. That was the old way. The way of arrogance and power that had led him to this desolate point. He remembered his promise to Valerus, the vow he had made to himself in the cold darkness of his empty throne room. I will look at her. And I will listen. Listening did not begin with speaking. It began with waiting. It began with respect. He had taken a century of her life without her consent. The least he could give her now was the choice of this single moment. He would not storm her new life. He would not lay siege to her peace. He would wait. He found a place deep in the shadows of the tree line, a spot where he could see the main path into the village without being seen. And he stood there, a statue of black leather and ancient sorrow, and waited. He was ceding all power to her. The next move was hers to make. He could wait a night. He could wait a year. He had an eternity to learn the patience he had never possessed. The silence in his own mind was still there, but for the first time, it was not a torment. It was a space of anticipation. A vigil. He found her. The knowledge settled in Alara's bones 3 days before she ever laid eyes on him. It was a subtle shift in the fabric of the world around Oakhaven, a dip in the temperature of the air, a new depth to the shadows at dusk. The birds seemed quieter. The woods felt watchful. It was the pressure of his immense, ancient presence, even muted and restrained, settling over the valley like a low-lying fog. She went about her days in a state of heightened, painful awareness. Every customer who entered the apothecary shop made her heart leap into her throat. Every tall shadow that fell across the street sent a jolt of ice through her veins. She felt stretched thin, a wire humming with a tension that was becoming unbearable. She considered Anya's words, turn and face the sun, but the fear of being burned was still too great. On the 4th day, she saw him. She was closing the shop for the evening, her hands trembling as she barred the door. The sun had set, and the lane was cast in the deep blue of twilight. He was standing at the far edge of the village, just where the road disappeared into the looming darkness of the Silverwood. He was a silhouette, impossibly tall and still, a figure of night come to claim the day. Her breath caught. Her first instinct was to bolt the door, to hide in the darkness of the shop and pray he would go away. But she didn't. She stood, her hand frozen on the iron bar, and simply watched him. He wasn't moving towards her. He wasn't doing anything. He was just there. A sentinel at the border of her world. It was a posture she did not recognize. It was not the stance of a conqueror, or a hunter closing in on his prey. It was the stance of a supplicant. He was waiting. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. He was giving her the choice. After a century of having every choice stolen from her, he was offering her this one. The power to engage, or to ignore. The power to approach, or to retreat. The sheer, unexpected humility of it disarmed her more than any show of force could have. This was not the king who had laughed in her face. This was someone else. Someone new and broken and utterly foreign. She spent the next 2 days in a state of suspended animation. She would see him at dusk, always in the same spot, a patient shadow at the edge of her life. He never tried to come closer. He never made a sound. He simply bore witness to the setting of the sun, and to the world she now inhabited. The villagers began to notice him, of course. They spoke of the Dark Watcher in the woods, a figure of local superstition. They were afraid, but his utter stillness, his lack of aggression, kept them from raising an alarm. They seemed to understand, on a primal level, that his vigil was for one person alone. On the 3rd night of his watch, Ilara found she could not eat. She could not read. The silence in her room was no longer her own, it was filled with the question of him. The chasm between them, the 100 yards of snow-dusted road that separated the village from the forest, felt like the most charged space on earth. Anya was right. She could not live like this, suspended between the past and the present. She had to walk into that space and see what lay there. She pulled on her thickest cloak, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She didn't know what she would say. She didn't know what he wanted. She only knew that the waiting had become more painful than any possible confrontation. As she stepped out of the shop, Anya's hand on her arm stopped her. The old woman looked into her eyes, her own gaze full of a deep, sorrowful wisdom. "Remember your garden, child," she whispered. "You are the one who decides what is allowed to grow there now." Ilara nodded, a lump in her throat, and squeezed Anya's hand. Then she turned and began to walk. The journey down the lane felt endless. Each step was a conscious decision. The cold air burned in her lungs. Her boots made soft crunching sounds in the snow, the only noise in the heavy twilight. His figure grew larger, more detailed. She could see the way the wind moved the edges of his black cloak. She could see the pale glint of his skin. He did not move as she approached, but she felt the shift in his attention, the immense, focused weight of his gaze. It was a gaze stripped of its power, of its arrogance. It was just a look. Intense. Searching. She stopped 10 feet from him. The space between them crackled with a million unspoken words, 100 years of shared history and a universe of pain. He looked diminished. The sheer, overwhelming force of his presence that had once filled a throne room and bent a court to his will was gone. He was still beautiful, in the terrifying, perfect way of his kind, but it was a beauty marred by a profound weariness. There were new lines of strain around his eyes, a hollowness in his cheeks. He looked like a man who had not slept in 1,000 years, and had only just realized he was tired. His eyes, the color of blood and old wine, held hers. They were not mocking. They were not angry. They were filled with a vast, desolate sorrow. It was the look of a man staring at the wreckage of a world he himself had destroyed. He had hunted her across a continent. He had waited for days in the freezing cold. He, the king of a timeless empire, had humbled himself at the edge of a mortal village. And now, as she stood before him, ready for a demand, a plea, a justification, Cation said nothing. He just looked at her, his silence a question, an apology, and a confession all in one. He had come all this way not to speak, but to finally listen. The silence stretched, thin and fragile as a spider's thread in winter. It was not the oppressive, commanding silence he had once wielded in his throne room. It was a different creature entirely, a silence of deference, of shame. It was an empty space he was offering her, for her to fill or to leave vacant as she chose. Ilara looked at the man before her, this fallen king, and saw the ghost of the monster she had fled. But the monster was fainter now, its edges blurred by a genuine, soul-deep exhaustion. The arrogance that had been the core of his being was gone, burned away, leaving behind something raw and uncertain. He was a ruin, and it was a ruin of his own making. She had rehearsed 1,000 speeches in her mind. Speeches full of rage and accusation. Speeches full of cold, cutting dismissal. Now, standing in the snow-hushed twilight, they all felt useless, like shouting at an echo. The man she had wanted to scream at no longer existed. Her own voice, when it came, was steadier than she expected. It was quiet, but it carried in the still air. "Why are you here, Cation?" His throat worked, as if the act of speaking was a forgotten, difficult art. His eyes, fixed on her face, held a universe of regret. He began, his voice a low, gravelly rasp, rough with disuse. "I came to understand." The answer was so simple, so unexpected, it stole the breath from her lungs. She had expected a demand, a justification, a plea for forgiveness. But understand was different. It was not about him, not entirely. It was about her. "Understand what?" she pressed, her voice gaining a sharp edge of the old pain. "What is there to understand? You had a century. The bond showed you everything. You saw my thoughts, you felt my heart break, and you laughed." The word laughed was a physical blow. He flinched, a slight, almost imperceptible movement, but in a creature of his absolute control, it was a cataclysm. His gaze dropped from her face to the snow at her feet. "I heard," he said, his voice barely audible. "I did not listen. I felt, but I did not comprehend. It was noise. A language I refused to learn." He looked up again, and the self-loathing in his eyes was stark and terrifying in its sincerity. To me, the bond was a tool. A convenience. A symbol of my power. I never considered what it cost you. I never considered you at all. Not as a person. Only as an extension of myself. He took a half-step forward, then stopped himself, a visible act of restraint. His hands, which she had seen shatter marble, were clenched into white-knuckled fists at his sides. When you were gone, he continued, struggling with the words, the silence. I thought it would be a relief. But it was not empty. It was filled with me. Only me. And I discovered that my own company was a poor substitute for the quiet of your soul. Ilara wrapped her arms around herself, a futile gesture against a chill that was coming from within. She had dreamed of hearing him admit his fault, of him finally seeing her. But the reality of it was not triumphant. It was just sad. A tragedy 100 years in the making. So you came here for your own relief? She asked, the question laced with a bitterness she couldn't hide. To assuage your own guilt? No, he said, the word sharp with a new, desperate honesty. I came here because I am lesser without you. Not because of the bond's utility. Because I was better when I had your goodness to measure myself against, even when I was too proud to see it. I came here to tell you that you were right. You were right to leave. You were right to do what you did. It was an act of courage I cannot imagine. He fell silent, his confession hanging in the frozen air between them. He was not asking for anything. He was not pleading for a second chance. He was simply bearing witness to the truth, a truth he had been blind to for a century. He was giving her the one thing he had always withheld, validation. The anger in Ilara's heart, the cold, hard knot of it she had carried for months, began to dissolve. It did not vanish in a rush of forgiveness, but slowly, painfully, it began to soften at the edges. What was left in its place was a profound, aching sorrow for the two people they had been, the girl who had hoped and the king who had been incapable of hope. I have a life here, she said softly, stating a simple, powerful fact. A small life. But it is mine. I know, he whispered. I have watched. From a distance, the admission was another crack in his armor. The great king, reduced to watching a mortal woman shelve books and buy bread, as if it were the most fascinating spectacle in the world. I will not disturb it. I only wanted. I needed you to know. That I see you now, Ilara. I see you. He said her name. Not the human, not my queen, not some possessive pronoun. Her name. It was a sound she had not heard from his lips in decades, and it landed in the quiet space of her soul with a strange and gentle weight. She stood there for a long time, the cold seeping into her bones. He waited, patient as the stones around them. He had made his pilgrimage. He had delivered his confession. The next move, and every move after, was hers. Finally, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was not forgiveness. It was not an invitation. It was an acknowledgement. An acceptance of his truth, and a confirmation of her own. The library is cold at night, she said, her voice quiet but clear. Anya keeps a fire going until late. It was not an offer of sanctuary. It was a simple statement of fact. But it was also an opening. A crack in the door she had slammed shut so violently. It was a suggestion that a conversation, a real one, begun after 100 years of silence, did not have to happen in the freezing dark. A flicker of something, not the old arrogance, but a fragile, hesitant light entered his eyes. It was the barest glimmer of hope, a hope he now knew he had not earned, but which he was being granted a chance to. He did not smile. His face had forgotten how. But he inclined his head, a gesture of profound, unkingly gratitude. Thank you, he said. Ilara turned and began the walk back to the warm, yellow light of the apothecary shop, back to the life she had built. She did not look back to see if he was following. She did not need to. For the first time, she trusted that he would keep a respectful distance. This was not an ending, nor was it a return to the beginning. It was something new and terrifying and uncertain.